analyst and expert on Russia, and not only Russia. Andreas Umland, who is with the Stockholm Center for the Eastern European Studies, also is doing the analysis and doing the expert work in Kiev. Of course, he is very, very valuable to discuss today what's going to happen in Russia in 2024. We are not doing today the fortune telling, but we will try to discuss to hear more from Andreas about the insights of the Russian politics. Just a few days ago, Vladimir Putin surprisingly, of course, joking, surprisingly was nominated as a candidate for the presidency, and there is another candidate, Madame Duntsova, who is considering herself to be the candidate for the presidency, as well as Grigory Yavlinsky is also planning to run for the president's office. So the day before yesterday, or yesterday, I think it was the Zjedina Rossiya's party meeting where he was also supported. The singers Shaman, Nadezhda Babkina, and Nikita Mikhalkov have initiated the candidacy of Putin. Andreas has offered, has published this very, very insightful and forward-looking article about Putinism 2.0. What is the chance for the Putinism 2.0? What is the prospect of Russia after Putin finally is gone? My question is there any chance for the changes in Russia? Andreas has answered some questions, and it was with Radio Svoboda, I think, just recently in his interview. He was more optimistic than myself about the future of the democratic Russia, or the chances of Russia in future. So I will ask him to share with us his optimism and his views before the end of this year, because I have rather skeptical prospects on Russia's future. But Andreas, please, I will stop here and ask Andreas to share his views about the future of Russia, about the prospects of Putinism in Russia, and we will definitely discuss the Russia-Ukraine war and Russia's war in Ukraine. What is his views on 2024 and the international support and what is coming in this war? Please, Andreas.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks a lot for having me here. It's a big honor to be here, and thanks for coming. Of course, I'm not going to tell you here the future of Russia and what will happen in 2024 in detail, but what I was trying to do in the interview and in this report for the Stockholm Center of Eastern European Studies and in some articles, to lay out some of the sort of structural issues that Russia has. And so the reason for my relative, let's say, not optimism about the future of Russia, but rather skepticism about the stability of the Putinist regime are two very, very simple facts. And the first one is that, as an old saying of political analysis goes, war changes everything. So the wars have the ability and the tendency and to impact countries. I see it, every month myself. When I'm in Kiev, the war has changed Ukraine fundamentally, and it has not yet changed Russia fundamentally, but but you can feel that it's starting to change the country because it's starting to impact more and more people's daily life. It has all sort of repercussions. And that means to me simply that the sort of general views that we had about Putin before the start of the big-scale invasion. The war, of course, started already in 2014. But that war and also the Russian-Georgian war, they did not really impact Russia. And the annexation of Crimea was rather stabilizing for the regime, and the Donbas war did not impact Russia much. And also, perhaps the start of the so-called special military operation had not yet, in 2022, made many did not generate many repercussions in Russia. It first generated the repercussions in the West. I think the West has really changed. The sanctions regime has been installed. There has been a revival of NATO, a change which I found most surprising of the German foreign policy. You probably heard this German word already, Zeitenwende, change of times, and indeed we have a change of times, including that also the new discussion about the candidacy for the association trio, that eventually, in an odd way, one could argue that Georgia has actually benefited in a very odd way from the war, and that the war has restarted the European debate about the fate of not only Ukraine but also Moldova and Georgia, and then has led to the candidacy for these three countries. And we just discussed before the meeting here that wasn't clear at all what these association agreements would lead to until February 2022. So there were these repercussions, and also already quite fundamental repercussions on Ukrainian domestic affairs and also Ukrainian international affairs, but not yet so far in 2022 on Russian domestic affairs. Russian international affairs were, of course, already affected, but they were not as much felt. But in 2023, I think we are starting to see increasing repercussions of the war on Russian domestic affairs, and the most vivid, of course, example was here the Prigozhin mutiny, which I think was not, as some people think, a theater, especially in Ukraine, but also in Russia. I don't know how it's here. There were lots of people, and still lots of people, who think that the Prigozhin mutiny was actually sort of a theater organized eventually by Putin himself, that it had some sort of benefit for Putin. I don't think it was. I think it was actually a real thing, and Russia was really on the brink of civil war. And had it not been for the intervention by Lukashenko, for this diplomatic intervention, who knows what would have come out of it. But there are also other signs. The disturbances in Makhachkala, this sort of anti-Semitic riot, and now we have this strange phenomenon of this professor in Moscow, Valery Solovey, now talking about 1.5 months already from a Moscow flat, and I think that's the most important thing. So it's not that Solovey is saying Putin is dead. This is not surprising. There are lots of conspiracy theories, and so. But the fact that he's able to do that from a Moscow flat, and that he's doing that every day, and it's discussed. I mean, it's laughed upon in the expert community. We all think, this is crazy stuff, and why should we deal with it? But the fact that he's allowed to do that, or that he has a krisha, a protection to do that, and that he's continuing doing it, and with every day he does it, I wonder, how can that be? And then there are some people who have then, of course, yet another conspiracy. They think that this is something that actually the FSB or the Kremlin has organized itself, and this is actually. But I don't see the rationale. Why would it be good for Putin if you have half of society discussing whether Putin is dead and whether the person who has just given this big press conference is not actually Putin, but a certain Vasilyevich. It's a doppelganger and so on. I don't see the rationale for why would that stabilize the regime? Why is that good for Putin's rule? why is that good for Putinism? I think it's subversive. It actually destroys the system. It has you know, maybe destroy is a too strong word, but it's not good for the, you know, you don't have that in a proper dictatorship. You shouldn't have these sort of discussions. You should have people like Prigozhin or these riots in Makhachkala. In an orderly dictatorship, you have control. The Kremlin should have control. And so that's what makes me wonder whether really Putin is going to serve his next term fully till 2030. And it makes me even more wonder whether, you know, there's then, of course, for him the opportunity to then become elected, if you want to call it elected again in 2030, and even to rule until 2036. I don't think that the probability of this happening is very high, because of the war. You know, it's just, the war is just, it's changing social relationship, it's changing the economy, it's changing political calculations, and I don't know what these changes will lead to. You know, maybe there will be actually, the end result will be a fully fascist regime, you know, that you will basically get a regime either with Putin or without Putin that is even more extreme than now. Yeah? You know, I wouldn't exclude that, and we have signs for that. You know, we have this, I mean, there's a lot of discussion in Ukraine and also in the West about the current regime should be called fascist. I've studied fascism for a while. I don't think it is quite it yet, because fascism was a revolutionary ideology that tried to change a new human being, that tried to create a new human being. And, you know, maybe, and that is not yet there with Putin. He doesn't want to create a new Russian. He wants to, can apply maybe the concept to a certain degree, this idea of a new birth to the policy on the occupied territories in Ukraine. There he wants to basically remake the Ukrainians into Russians. He basically wants to destroy the Russian nation, the Ukrainian nation, and transform these citizens. He doesn't want to necessarily kill them. He wants to make them into Russians. You know, and only when only those who are against that then they are in trouble. They may be deported or put in prison or even killed and tortured and whatnot. But there you could argue maybe that is a sort of fascist policy. You could argue that this is sort of something that could be. But inside the Russian Federation, I don't think it's yet a revolutionary ideology. In that way, it could become worse. You know, you could actually either Putin could himself become a fascist in the way that he wants to really change Russians, you know, the nature of the Russian nation, something like that, or that somebody else will come who will try that. So I'm not that optimistic. So there is this bad option. The thing is, I would say that this option is actually less likely than a change, if there is a change of regime in the liberal direction. I think the liberal direction is actually, once you have a change of the regime, the more likely thing to happen than radicalization. So the war and the effects of the war are the first thing, I think, that make me believe that the period of stability in Russia is coming to the end. And the second, again, very simple fact is that Russia has no succession mechanism. So the old Soviet Union had a succession mechanism. You had the Central Committee and, you know, the Politburo, and you had a certain institutional framework in which to determine who will be the successor. Or you have, let's say, like in countries like Azerbaijan or in North Korea, you have simply the dynastic principle, you know, that the son becomes the next ruler. Yeah. And now, actually, if you believe Solovey, there seems to be something happening like that in Russia, that allegedly Patrushev wants to install his son as a new, that is what Solovey is saying. You know, but that is something that I think it's not going to go through, something like that. So you don't have this dynastic principle in Russia. You also don't have a sort of council of elders, or religious council, or like in Central Asia, a sort of a certain negotiation or consociation process between regional clans, where they then sort of assemble and then they sort of come to some sort of solution. I don't see that really being there. What you have is these sort of clans. You have the different agencies. Many of the agencies are armed. And of course, they may all understand that if the regime destabilizes, or if Putin goes for one reason or another, either for health reasons or for political reasons, then they have to find an agreement, but they don't have a framework within which to negotiate an agreement. So it's a very informal system. It's a Putinist system in that the whole system rests on the personality of Putin, who is a moderator between the different clans. And if he disappears, then I think they will have simply the problem of choosing a new leader. And what then happens?
It won't be Mishustin.
Yeah, I mean, Mishustin would be that would be the constitutional path, and that is the model of how Putin became president.
Right.
He became prime minister, and then Yeltsin resigned, and then he was elected president. But Mishustin does not come from the security agencies. So, that is already the first, will the security agencies really tolerate somebody who is not from there, and what is the home power of Mishustin? Yeah? Does he have the ambition? He's also popular. That is also something that is interesting. His popularity rate is surprisingly high, and Mishustin wouldn't be the worst choice but my suspicion is simply that there are others who want to be the first, who think that now it's their time, about when they were Putin.
Could we name them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Petriashvili seems to have this sort of indeed, and so and there may be others, there may be more nationalistic people, and I don't know what will happen, but my feeling is that there's no institutional structure in which to have that. Yeah, so it's not even clear who would be the so-called selectorate, who would be the people who would decide who is the next ruler. It could be the Security Council, but maybe it's a smaller circle than the Security Council, or on the contrary, it's a larger circle than the Security Council. People who are not in the Security Council, but who have enough home power to say, yeah, I want to be part of at least of the circle of people who will elect the new ruler, and it's also not clear who could have a legitimate claim to be the next. So all of these things are sort of up in the air, and they make me sort of hopeful in the sense that I cannot imagine that Putinism will continue without Putin. And if Putinism cannot continue without Putin, if you don't have the top moderator there who is sort of moderating the different clans, then the whole thing becomes very fluid, and the stakes are very high. You can end up being like a new Sechin, but you can also end up like Ulyukayev in prison. Yeah, or you may even fall out of a window. It's not clear what it means. If you lose, what's going to happen?
That's my favorite joke.
Yeah, to fall out of the window. There was this joke by I think was it Blinken who said NATO has an open door policy and Russia has an open window policy. So there are all these unclear things. Who has a claim to power? Who can be part of the selectorate, and what are the stakes of the power struggle? Is that going to be a very cannibalistic, the new regime that will come out of it, that will actually then eat its own people, like Stalin's regime basically, and Putin's partly too, where you then have these sort of Putinists ending up in prison or falling out of a window or becoming if they are lucky, perhaps ambassador somewhere. So all of these things are, or maybe it will be a more moderate regime. It will be basically like, I don't know, Khrushchev, it's sort of less aggressive domestically.
What the type of Khrushchev replacement would survive? Mishustin, would he survive in Russia, post-Putin Russia?
I mean, these things are, I cannot say that.
Right.
But what I'm just seeing is the structure. We cannot.
And where is the war in this context?
Well, and the war is sort of, it's increasing the instability because it creates a lot of tension in society. Economic tension, social tension, and even sort of these ideological tensions that people start, with the radicalization of Putin, now Putinism is now actually different from Putinism 10 years ago. It's now much more radical, with this LGBT now, and it's really becoming as this sort of ultra-conservative, bizarre regime that, and I'm calling it bizarre because it's implemented by people who were earlier serving a left-wing regime. They came out of a special service of a left-wing regime that would actually suppress, let's say, the Russian Orthodox Church. And now the Russian Orthodox Church is one of the major pillars of the regime. Actually, the sort of maybe ideologically most important sort of policy shaper in Russia. So this is all, and I think that's also a result of the war. That sort of the regime is looking for these so-called skirpers, for sort of an ideological foundation with which it can at least consolidate a part of society, maybe not the whole of society, but then it alienates, of course, other parts of society. I was just this morning, I was reading that a remark that was saying that the use of the word Ruski has again become very popular. The Ruski is starting to replace Rossiyski as a term, because it's they sort of return to this sort of Russian history and Russian Orthodox Church and so on. But that is, of course, alienating the non-Ruski in Russia. So this is you have all these developments going on, and I think they are all. Many of them are linked to the war, and I think what will become really interesting when and if I would rather say when Ukraine achieves military victories. If Ukraine manages to isolate, let's say, Crimea, as they obviously want, if they destroy the bridge, if they cut off the land connection, if they get the towers and F-16 and so on, if they manage to cut off basically Crimea from maybe they will not immediately attack Crimea, but they could simply cut it off from the supply lines, then it becomes interesting. Or if they manage to capture Mariupol or Donetsk or a major city, then the whole legitimacy of the regime will be under question. And then all of these things, with Putin's age and the institutional, these tensions, this will all accelerate, and we may have something, a second Prigozhin type of event. So far, at this moment, it looks not good for Ukraine. They have this problem with the artillery ammunition. Russia has solved this with the help of North Korea and is going into a war economy. But that could change. My feeling is that both the EU and the US will eventually come around. They will, get the money going, and they will get the production of ammunition going, and they will deliver more weapons and better weapons. So maybe not in 2024, but in 2025, at the latest, I would think that there could be new victories, Ukrainian victories, and then I think we can assume that the regime will stabilize. I think then, for me, it's I cannot say it for sure, but I think it's clearly over 50% if there are major victories again for the Russian for the Ukrainian army, then this will have repercussions in Moscow.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Let me be the devil's advocate right now, and sure. It's better to be put in shoes than. I think Putin's view for the moment, he is enjoying this situation. This on agreement in Washington D.C. about the budget support to Ukraine of 61 billion. In the European Union, there is still halted 50 billion euros for Ukraine. So Putin's plan is to outset Biden from the presidential term. He hopes that Trump will win, and he will get everything he wants from Ukraine. And you mentioned optimism regarding the liberal change in Russia. What gives you ground to have the optimism with regard to the Russian opposition? Opposition which is basically outside and is evaluated as a very weak and very fragmented, which is the real problem for Russia.
Yeah, I mean, what will eventually happen in the US, I also don't know. And what a Trump presidency would mean, I can't say. I mean, he's really unpredictable. And, but even with the Trump presidency, I'm not sure that the picture would be really as black and white. You know, that because there are also in the Republican Party and in Congress and so on, there are these sort of pro-Ukrainian forces, and I think it will be much more complicated. But maybe Putin is also mistaken in thinking what he may be calculating on, and that is actually something that I think is actually more plausible and much more scary, is that if Trump becomes elected, then the domestic situation in the US could become unstable as it was on 6th of January. You know, that you have then so much conflict within the US that actually the US will be absorbed by its own problems. So that is really worse. I mean, that will affect, of course, the entire world, not just the war. That will be a disaster, really. That is maybe something that I think that is in a way more plausible for me to calculate on than to have really a Trump who would become just basically anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian president, because that will not be easy for Trump to do. And if Nikki Haley becomes president, she may actually be better in terms for Ukraine than even Biden. So who knows? I mean, so I don't know. You know, maybe I shouldn't be talking about that because that's not my field. I haven't been to the US for a long time. I follow it also on the media. Of course, what I mean by liberalization here is not a victory by the liberal opposition in Russia, because they are defunct currently. You know, they are in prison or abroad, you know, suppressed and so on. But if the different factions in the Kremlin cannot find a consensus about how to continue, if they cannot choose either a new leader by consensus or create a collective leadership that will be stable, if they cannot basically move into a Putinism 2.0, then for me, I think then, you know, that there may be a sort of democracy not created by Democrats emerging, sort of democracy by default, because then different factions may turn to society for social support, and then suddenly elections may actually get some meaning again. That doesn't mean that Navalny gets out and will be a candidate in presidential elections, but it could mean that you may then have actually real competition in an election. But if you have different factions, you know, pushing forward their candidates, and then we could get into a more sort of politically liberal situation, because the alternative would be civil war. You know, they may have to then, if they cannot resolve this issue, just, you know, moving the pyramid to another chief patron of the top, then you know, then there are only two ways to go. Either you find some sort of method with which to actually you know, accommodate different factions and clans and agencies, or you go into civil war, and some Ukrainians are of course hoping for that, exactly this, that it will end in civil war, as it was when Prigozhin was moving in the direction, I believe it was on the verge of civil war. So it's not such a fantastic actually hope as one may think. You know, this is all very speculative.
And the collapse of Russian Federation as well?
Well, then even that would become then at least.
How realistic do you think this?
It's difficult to say. Yeah, I mean, then if you are in a, you know, the war changes everything, but civil war even more changes everything. You know, then you have a totally different situation, and then I could even imagine that, you know, let's say a region like Kaliningrad would say, you know, we rather want to be with the European Union and in this federation, so-called federation that is falling apart. You know, and also I think for Georgia and for the Caucasus, I think the North Caucasus would then become something that would probably also unravel. It may actually be a problem for the Caucasus, you know, because I don't know. I mean, if you have disorder in Moscow and then, you know, certain groups in the North Caucasus starting to have, you know, independence ideas, you know, all things could then be possible. I don't know what would then be happen. I think they would still be sane enough to try to avoid this scenario. They are aware of that themselves. But as I said, they don't have an institutional structure so far how to arrange that. And then maybe they will actually come back to elections. They will say, you know, let's have an election and let's the people decide who will be the next ruler. And then, you know, and then elections also have their own dynamic. They, you know, then media will become more open. Then, you know, stories will come out that have not been told for many years. I mean, you would then have a certain thaw, I think, you know, or tipping, as in perhaps something like that. And once you have some sort of pluralism again, then many things are becoming possible, and then perhaps even, you know, Navalny may get out alive from prison, and then he may have his claim again, and things like that. So.
Is Navalny a good choice for Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I cannot look into his head. You know, I mean, he made many bad statements, and you know, when he was talking with Rondeli, and so you know, it was really bad. But that is many years ago. So maybe he has changed. It seems that he has changed. You know, the statements he made before he was put into prison were much more enlightened than his earlier nationalistic statements. Yeah, I think he would be. You know, I would tend to give the credit that he would be perhaps a good president. Although, again, I cannot vouch for him in any way. A colleague of mine who has died, Galina Kozhevnikova, a Russian student, researcher of Russian nationalism, had actually, like 20 years ago, she had a discussion when Navalny was still a civil society activist. They had a discussion about taped also on video, and she was confronting him then with his sort of ethno-nationalist statements that he made then. But that seems to have changed. He seems to have now better understood. He also got this, you know, this treatment in Germany. And I mean, the West has also, you know, treated him well, and I think that may have also had an impact on him, that he has become less nationalistic, more pro-Western as a result of his treatment in Germany and the sort of general.
First, we hope he survives, because the latest news about his disappearance, you know, is very, very concerning and worrisome. You know, but I think for the elections in 2024, Putin's the Russia's presidential elections, it looks for me rather boring. I mean, it will be a theater, as you mentioned in context with Prigozhin. Prigozhin's mutiny was not a theater, but definitely. Do you think that the cases, issues like and the developments like in Makhachkala you mentioned, and you were mentioning in your interview about the importance of anti-Semitic protests in Makhachkala. Also, on the top of the crisis of X, do you think that the process is going into the right direction for the liberal world and the wrong direction for Putin? You're saying in your interview that 2024 from this point could be an interesting year. If not, if you put alone for a moment the war with Ukraine, in Ukraine, so what's going to be a trouble, concern, challenge for Putin to regain his power and serve until his real death? I mean, because I do not care too much and follow what Solovey is saying, you know, here in Georgia.
No, it's not what he's saying. Is That he's saying it,
right.
and that he's saying it for Moscow. If he would be sitting in Vilnius, I would, I would also say,
Some people say he speaks for Patrushev, but
but then he speaks. But the content of what he says is very anti-Patrushev.
Yes.
So it could be, maybe even. But it's I've discussed it with Russian analysts, and they immediately see that as some sort of operation, psychological operation.
So let's leave alone Solovey. Let's get back to the...
But just to make clear, I'm not saying that Solovey is right, but that he's saying this from Moscow, from his flat, and he's continuing every day. He's crazy stuff. Anyway, so I agree totally with you that the elections themselves will probably be the usual theater, and they will go through with it, and it may not make much difference how the Russians will vote. 19 the last state-to-month elections were hugely. I'm not sure now about the exact year. Was it 2020? 20, yes. Thank you.
18.
Or 18. Oh yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm confused. Sorry. So there was a huge. Over 10 million votes may have been falsified in these elections. So they may do that. That was the allegation. So the elections are not the problem. It's more like inside the ruling circle. Inside the different security agencies, the different ministries, the clans. So Prigozhin obviously had some people in Moscow who were protecting him. So it wasn't just Prigozhin, because he couldn't have done that. And oddly, I also think that some people in Moscow were, of course, they knew, of course, that he was preparing this thing.
And it was not just Surovikin?
I don't know, but and that this is even happening, that, he couldn't have prepared that with just, locally doing it, and the FSB and all these agencies, that doesn't happen this way, So there were people in Moscow knowing that this would come, and then, also the reaction then, that they did not suppress it, that he could go there to Rostov, and then he moved to Moscow, and he was shooting down planes and so on. So this all looks all very strange. This is not how a proper dictatorship works. This should not be allowed. And then you need somebody like Lukashenko to take care of it. It's pathetic, in fact, for Putin. I mean, they all sort of they have the propaganda machine that can usually then project in another picture, and also that they're now, of course, projecting this picture of stability. And but as I said, I mean, war changes everything, and we don't know how it will develop next year. What will be like with the X crisis? What there may be new repercussions on, inflation and these mothers now and wives who want their soldiers to come back. So there was an expectation that Putin would announce some sort of mobilization or some sort of solution for these soldiers, Russian soldiers who have been there now the whole war, and he didn't propose anything, and he said that there's so many contractiki, people who want to get a contract on the front line, that there's no problem actually, but the soldiers are not returning. So this could all spiral out, and so. As I said, I think what we are used to is this super stable Putin is who goes through economic crisis, who goes through he puts on Medvedev, then Medvedev goes, he comes back, then he does this, and he has always a sort of a trick, a new rabbit out of his head. But war is a different situation. I don't think you can sort of these tricks. They don't work this way anymore. So it's sort of he cannot control it anymore. And you have the sanctions. I mean, the sanctions have been very pathetic so far. They have circumvented the sanctions. They have found lots of these middlemen or middle countries that then would benefit from circumventing the sanctions. But I think at the end of the day, these sanctions will have effect. And so it's more like gut feeling, There's no, it's very difficult to predict any. That the combined effect of internal tensions, of the war and of the sanctions will make 2024 interesting, as I said.
Okay.
What eventually will make it, what actually will make it interesting, I don't know. There could be, but it will not be a boring year. I don't think it will be just like any year of Putin, elections, and then he gets reaffirmed, and then they do their usually stuff. I think these times are over.
Last question from my side about the Ukraine and war of Russia in Ukraine. So we discussed, and you sound rather optimistic about the future assistance to Ukraine. I hope very much that Ukraine will get what they need for the decisive victory. But again, coming presidential elections in the United States, the elections in the European Parliament next year, do you agree that there is a pressure on Ukraine now to start the negotiations first? And do you think that if there is a pressure on Ukraine, it will increase in future to put President Zelensky in front of terrorist Putin to discuss the truce, at least truce with Russia?
There are lots of players and lots of unknown variables in this. It's domestic affairs of Western countries in the EU and so on. It's also a lot about discourses and actually we have a certain, as think tankers, we have a certain role to play in that, and not a big role, but I think we can sort of point out certain things. So it will depend on a lot on the domestic situations in various key Western countries, above all the US, but also Germany and France, and what will be the debate in the EU. And this recent vote for the start of the negotiations makes me hopeful. That's why I'm also sort of optimistic on that the money will come through eventually. And the US, I know, as I said, less domestically than Western Europe, but my feeling is also that it will come eventually through. I cannot imagine that they will simply abandon that. And there may be pressure that I don't know what Ukrainians think here, but Zelensky has no choice. Then there's no political space currently for negotiations in Ukrainian domestic affairs, because there is no. Ukraine is neither on the verge of disaster, that it would be something like when Poroshenko signed the Minsk agreements, that basically, you have the pistol here on the head, and then you sign something. Nor is Ukraine has now make a bit advantage and could hope for a good outcome. Okay. So that negotiations actually. So for instance, negotiating. Let's say I could imagine that could become a future topic for negotiations, to have, let's say, on Crimea a temporary UN peacekeeping mission. That would be a civil administration, and maybe also even UN forces there for, I don't know, a year or 2 or 3 or something like that. So that could be a legitimate topic of negotiation. But Ukraine is not there, clearly. But Ukraine is also not on the verge of disaster. So I don't think, whatever the West will say, Zelensky will not do it, because there's no. Why would? Because there's now also opinion polls that say that the percentage of the hawks, that those who don't want to make any concessions to Russia, has slightly gone down in 2023 in comparison to 2022, but it's still a majority, and it's still the dominant discourse. And the parties, not just Zelensky's parties, but of course Poroshenko and Timoshenko's parties and Holos and so on, they are all hawkish, you know, and partly more hawkish than Zelensky. So so there's no political space for this. You cannot do that in Ukraine. You cannot say we're now going to go into negotiations. Even if Biden tells you to do so, that people would say, so what? We don't want now negotiations. What can we negotiate for? We won't give away a Crimea or Zaporizhia or something, and we won't change our constitution. You know, the NATO and the EU accession is now in the Ukrainian constitution. When Poroshenko tried to change the constitution in August 2015 after the Minsk agreements. So the Minsk agreement sort of foresaw that Ukraine would change its constitution and give a special status to the occupied territories of the Donbass. When Poroshenko tried to do that under French and German pressure in August 2015, you know, there was a civil unrest in front of the Verkhovna Rada. Several people died, lots of wounded people, and it didn't go through. And it was a minor concession. It would have been a temporary special status for the Donbass. It didn't mean anything politically, really. It was just it would have been a symbolic, basically, act that would not have had many practical repercussions. But even that was not possible. There was immediately, you know, the hawks came forward and say, no, this is we are not going to do that. And Zelensky is under the same pressure. So you have this. You have also that is also something very typical of countries in war. You have patriotic outbidding. So you have the patriots. You know, you cannot be dovish in war. You know, the hawks will always win domestically because, you know, it's just the dynamic of a war. Because the stakes are so high, and you have all the veterans. You have families who have lost them. You know, they would simply say, no. You don't go for any, you know, no negotiations maybe, but no concessions. But if Ukraine does not make any concessions to Russia, then negotiations do not make any sense. Yeah. And then you have also now, you have the Russian constitution. It's not actually any longer about international law. You know, the Russian constitution says that these territories are Russian, you know. So also Putin is in a bind. He cannot.
It doesn't look like that he wants to sit down and negotiate something with Zelensky for the moment.
Yeah, or he wants to negotiate actually that Ukraine gives him, you know, because the rest of Zaporizhia and Kherson and because he didn't manage to conquer it. So that would be his topic for negotiation. Yeah. And you know, I mean, this is it would be, what would they talk about? I mean, this is and then, you know, you have the deported children, you have the you know, the reparations issue, you have the prisoners of war and so on. I mean, there's so many. How would they talk even with each other? You know, it's only when they really are, you know, if the troops are basically, if Kiev is surrounded by Russian troops, you know, and Kiev is basically, you know, and there's no way they can, maybe then they would sort of, or, you know, or the other way, when, as I said, if they have major victories, then they could negotiate the transfer, the type of transfer of Crimea under Ukrainian control, with, for instance, a UN peacekeeping mission in the Donbass or in Crimea or somewhere else.
We shall see. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll stop abusing my position and open the floor for the questions, of course. And Shota,
yes, thank you.
You have a question, I think.
Thank you, Alex.
Please introduce yourself and take the question. We have
my name is Petriashvili. I work here for the Rondeli Foundation. Pleasure to have you. The question is about the Russian economy. What we all should like Russian economy to do is to experience crisis in such a way that, in either of two ways, that either it makes it harder for Russia to continue the war, or this economic crisis causes political crisis.
Yes.
It's a wish list, but are we any close to this wish list, or should we hope for something else?
I'm not an economist, I should say. My impression is from the media is that the war economy issue has been solved by Russia. Russia has now a war economy. And currently they found these sort of alternative partners, and but the social issue, maybe that's that I have more hopes for that eventually, like with the eggs now, that these sort of things, you know, inflation will rise, and maybe then maybe you will then, you know, there's virtually no unemployment now in Russia, and you have then also these provincial families that get money because the man has died, and then they get these huge amounts, and so on. But here my sort of hope in a way would be that inflation would all eat it away, that they will get money, but then the money will lose its value. But again, I'm not expert enough to really evaluate that. I listen sometimes to Milov, who sounds very sort of optimistic that eventually the economy will really have more and more problems. But so far the unfortunate conclusion is that they have created a war economy.
And is there anything that sanctions can do if they are applied?
I don't know. Right. I should. You know, that also demands a lot of technological knowledge that I don't have. I would know.
Thank you. Next question, please, Eka.
To continue, should I mention Milo? And my question is about, I'm just interested about the opinion of Russian liberals, including political figures as well as media. Initially, the response from them, and I'm not very much in telling that I got the impression, superficially, the initial response was that, you know, very critical. And then little by little, we were hearing kind of statements which were not in line with what maybe here in Georgia or maybe in Ukraine would like to hear. Even, you know, but one of the conference we wrote was, you know, please do not call us imperialists. You know, we are not. And also,
was it the Warsaw Security Forum?
It was Brussels.
Okay, because there was a similar confrontation he had then with Kasparov actually in the Warsaw Security Forum.
Yeah, so this confrontation, even between Russian liberals, is kind of obvious, as well as those media representatives, journalists, kind of the stories which were not in line with, for example, Latvia national interest. So how would you assess overall? Because these are the people who, if we get to post-Putin period, are those who should play the role in creation of new Russian state.
Yeah, I mean, in Ukraine, I'm every month in Ukraine, there's now basically also the liberals are very unpopular. There are very few Russian figures, you know, himself would be still somebody who would, Kasparov perhaps, would be still sort of, and there's Ilya Ponomaryov who lives in Ukraine. I call him the Russian Liebknecht because 100 years before, he was the only one in the State Duma who voted against the annexation of Crimea. Yeah?
Yes.
And 100 years before, Karl Liebknecht was the only deputy in the Reichstag who voted against the credits for World War I. So pretty much exactly 100 years before. So there are these singular figures who are accepted in Ukraine, and the rest are also, the liberals are also imperialists, and they have this sort of deep-seated, you know, hidden perhaps imperial impulses, and they are not to be trusted. I'm somewhat less, you know, skeptical towards them. As came out when I commented Navalny, is they develop. I mean, they may come out of more nationalistic and imperialistic sort of, but I think this war and what they are now also experiencing, the stigmatization of Russians across Europe and North America and so on, and I think that is also changing them. And they, you know, we have now all this decommunization discourse, and they are sort of on the defense, and sometimes they sort of are apologetic and say, yeah, we cannot, you know, simply, you know, we're of course ready to condemn Putin, but we are still not ready to condemn Pushkin because of what Pushkin's sort of imperial versus whatever he has written, or Dostoevsky or somebody like that. So yes, they are on the defensive, but in Germany we had a similar situation after World War II. That the whole population and also the majority of the intellectuals came out of a very imperialistic, militaristic, nationalistic, but eventually this people and this elite built a rather good, altogether democracy. So I'm not as skeptical as most Ukrainians are, and also perhaps as most Georgians are. I guess there's also a lot of.
You do not sound too optimistic either.
No, I'm not saying that they're I mean, some of them are sort of somebody like Kiriyenko was supposed to, who came out of the liberal camp, and he's now part of the regime, and others too. For Chubais, it was then at a certain point too much. He went out, yeah, so he couldn't take it anymore. So, but he had also these he had this liberal empire ideas and all these bizarre things, yeah. So, but I think maybe they are now. My feeling is that they are now also sort of reflecting on their own sort of past and the Russian. I mean, usually you would have like in the 1990s, you would have this sort of the condemnation of the Soviet Union, but a sort of nostalgic look back on the Tsarist empire, and that was still often very bizarre, that because the Tsarist policies were partly, of course, let's say, more anti-Ukrainian than the Soviet policies, partly. And I don't know how it was with Georgia, but and then why would they then go back to this? But yeah, but I'm more interested here in the less in the people and what people think, but in the structure of politics. If there is a pluralistic structure of politics again, then you would have an open media discourse, open intellectual discourse, and then you could imagine something like a domestic Russian, what we call the German Vergangenheitsbewegung, coming to terms with the past, so that people would then reflect in new ways about the Tsarist history, the Soviet history, the post-Soviet history, and then they would see the sort of the imperial trends, and I mean, they've got enough territory; they don't need anymore. So. Yeah, there's of course also a large Russian diaspora now that is sort of in the Western discourse, and I would hope that some of them would come back in a new situation to Moscow when it's not any longer dangerous, and then perhaps exert a good experience. I mean, we have to hope for something like that. We have to. I mean, these are the only people we got. There's no better.
There's Vladimir Kara-Murza in prison for 25 years. I think
he's one of the best. Actually.
Yes.
Yeah. I know him personally.
Yeah. But I doubt very much that before the end of Putin and the Putinism, he will be possible to get out from prison from Siberia. One more question.
There's someone else. This is ping pong. We have to.
Dear guests, do not hesitate to put the questions.
So yeah, I agree with your assessment that Russia has built a whole economy, and now the hope is that Ukrainian magic maneuver will cause Russian military defeat, and then it can unravel the stability inside Russia. But then Zaluzhny says that the sides are pretty much stuck, and unless one of the sides get a major technological superiority, we are not going to see a huge maneuver of it. What's the way out? We are stuck for a long time in attrition warfare, or is there a hope for quicker? I see the face that doesn't not much.
Well, it depends on the West and a lot of domestic factors in the West. And we have this instrumentalization of the Ukraine issue in domestic affairs, like in the US now, the border issue that they tie up, and we have things like that also in West European countries, or the way that Orban now uses is to solve his domestic issues, you know, to use the Ukraine issue to get money out of the EU and so on. And that is very, so if the West comes around and sends the right weapons and enough weapons, then a new offensive becomes possible. And I would still argue in wartime there are more black swans than in peacetime. So there may be new things that we cannot now imagine that will create new opportunities. You know, like this Prigozhin was a sort of very few people expected it. We had actually in our center in Stockholm, we had one of the few people who did expect it, Alexander Goltz, a Russian military analyst, who published actually a report 3 days before the Prigozhin mutiny, which was called Russian Civil War. You know, because he followed the internal military discussions, and then he concluded from that something is breeding in the military, and so perhaps something like that will happen again, and then things that, and maybe even at the current situation, there could be a window open again, and the Prigozhin mutiny did not lead to any changes on the front line. You know, it was sort of, but if it had continued, it would have probably had. There would have been openings at the front line, and then perhaps the Ukrainian army could have taken advantage of it. I wouldn't exclude this sort of black swan thing. Maybe I'm too optimistic here, but as I say, I mean, that's an old saying that has nothing to do with Ukraine, that war changes everything, and this sort of image that we have of Putinism as a stable regime that sort of improvises and always gets out of difficult situations. I think that this phase is over. We're now in a different world, actually, and how this will play out, I don't know.
Okay, Kia, you have a question?
So what is this issue with the anti-corruption legislation? Some local Ukrainians are criticizing the new drafts that they have. What's the reason that Zelensky cannot lead these reforms himself? Because I'm in contact with some people. They say that he does not want to have too many issues on himself, or at least I don't know. Particularly, what is the problem with the anti-corruption?
Well, I mean, in general, you know, there have been results. You know, in the transparency index, Ukraine has improved. It still has a bad index, but it's not as bad as it used to be. And you know, we had we had a number of scandals. We had people put in prison. This disputed anti-oligarch law, and now this new things. Yeah, I guess. I mean, I can only speculate, frankly. I mean, it's also not something that I'm following so closely. That there may be sometimes these anti-corruption measures may be disruptive for the whole organism, sort of how Ukraine now functions, and it more or less functions. You know, that's it doesn't function as well as one wishes, but it has a certain, you know, a certain structure, and the structure has turned out to be actually much better than many thought. You know, that was the assumption that many had at the beginning, not only Putin, but also many Western observers, that is card house. You know, you would just dip it and it would fall, and you know, and it has actually performed rather well. But still, of course, you have corruption, and you need this legislation. I think his you know, overall, I would say that his sort of this anti-corruption agenda with which he came, you know, with this movie, Sluha Narodu, and so on, was genuine, but he then encountered the reality of the power relationships, and also the problems in actually implementing anti-corruption without measures without violating sort of basic rules of law, then you cannot simply, I don't know, expropriate an oligarch, so it's simply against the law. So I don't have any more sort of more specific. I'm also not so deeply, I have to admit, embedded in Ukraine that I will know sort of these things that are going on behind the scenes. But again, historically, wars have had so there's another old saying in political analysis that not only do states make wars, but also wars make states. So, historical experience is actually that countries often come with a better state out of the war, because the state has to function in a war. Otherwise, the state, it's an existential battle for the state, including perhaps a less corrupt state. So maybe the war will on the whole, have the effect that corruption will go down. So far, the record, I agree, is ambivalent.
Okay, so again.
Don't forget to Rondeli also work for this foundation. What is your assessment of the current status of Russia-Georgia relations, Russian policy towards Georgia? Are there any changes after the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, and how would you explain if there are?
I don't know it well enough, I have to say. I've dealt a little bit in my publications with Georgia before. I haven't also the domestic affairs. I haven't really followed them much. I wouldn't know, frankly. Maybe I shouldn't. Especially here, I should talk about my sort of naive understanding that I have. I had in 2021, I had an article where I made actually Georgia a major topic in criticizing Merkel's chancellorship. So that basically Georgia was betrayed twice in 2008, in Bucharest and after the Russian-Georgian war. My suspicion is simply that now Putin has his handful in Ukraine, and I was actually giving this morning an interview, and I was asked about his statements about Finland, where he made this sort of threats against Finland, and I would say this is just rhetoric. I think whenever a country is a member of NATO, it's basically safe. I'm also much, in the Baltics, people don't like when I'm saying that because they think I'm naive or something like that. But so far, my observation is that Putin knows very well where the border is between NATO and non-NATO. So there was this incident with Turkey, for instance, in 2015, when Turkey shot down a fighter plane. And normally, Russia would have had to answer militarily against having a fighter plane shot down. And normally, sort of Russian military doctrine would prescribe that Russia should have destroyed, let's say, a Turkish airport in response to a Russian plane being shot down. But they cut down the import of tomatoes. They had this sort of economic sanctions against Turkey, and after a year it became fine again. So I think potentially Georgia is also here. I have to say is still in danger because it's not a NATO member. But now Putin has his handful in Ukraine. He doesn't need a second front. So Georgia is really here also directly involved in that. I think if he, God forbid, should have a victory in Ukraine, then Georgia could be next on his list. Indeed. But that's again, maybe that's too easy. Maybe actually more of the on this, but that's just looking on how they may be thinking in Moscow. I think Finland or Estonia are much less in danger than countries like Georgia.
And you can also imagine what Putin thinks if he feels that you are afraid of him.
Yeah. He's certainly trying to make people afraid. Yeah.
No, then if he feels that you are afraid, then he thinks that he needs to proceed further to threaten you and control you.
Yeah.
You must be always showing that I'm not afraid.
Yeah.
We are ready for everything.
Shota has again the attempt to deviate Andreas from his optimistic vibe.
Okay,
I
my
guess.
third and final question. Okay, if we are stuck in the battlefield and none of the sides have the technological superiority and we are moving towards attrition warfare, we have Russia has advantage because it has stronger economy and better production. Then why are the Russians attacking like crazy in places like Avdiivka and elsewhere, taking huge losses? What's the rationale?
I mean, the common explanation is that Putin needs that for the elections. You know, he needs to have some topic for the elections that he can say, look, we took Avdiivka.
Otherwise, what?
Yeah, I mean, it would make him look nicer, you know, for the Russian people if he can come with some sort of victory, even if it's just just. And if you look at on the front line, this Avdiivka is indeed, it's a sort of, it looks a bit like odd from the Russian side that they have this, and it looks vulnerable also. But so far the Ukrainians are defending it.
Just 2.5 months and huge losses and no hardly any advances. So what's the point?
I mean, I think his calculation was that if I only put enough meat there, we will get it back at a very high price, and then I can say we got Avdiivka. So, and then you know the war is a success. You know, that is, I think they have more and more legitimacy problems. You know, that how do we legitimize this war? You know, what is it? What is the aim of it? Why is it not, you know, working? Why are they stuck? Why, you know? So it's and he has this. I mean, he has this rather dangerous ultra-nationalist opposition, you know, which is criticizing him from the right, which says, you know, we need full mobilization, we need a martial law, we need to do a full-scale war, not just a sort of half special operation. So he has to respond to this part of the society and as well. That's often not seen, who are unhappy. And that may be even for him a more dangerous part, you know, because they could, you know, like Prigozhin was basically part of this part of society, you know, they have weapons and they have, you know, and they are really fanatics, you know, like, that's why they did put Girkin in. Now I think Girkin is under arrest.
He's in prison.
Or is he still in prison?
Yes.
Yeah, he's still in prison.
I thought he was on arrest. Okay, yeah. So they have to take, you know, take care of these people. And for this sort of electorate, if we want to call it that way, he needs he needs to show something.
Okay, Eka, I think again, it's a kind cross-cut.
Closed door discussion.
Yes.
So it's okay that you're asking a question. But, and I'm really happy that you can have someone to check what yes. Again, continuing this discussion between the Russians. And the interesting discourse I observed is regarding the opinion polls. So the Levada people were always kind of, you know, taught by those liberals that there's no sense basically of making the polls because people are afraid to say what they think. But then they go to the polls and make the decisions, and that's all the political action that's translated. So, how would you assess how true are those polls? Because, you know, it does not seem that necessarily they are wrong. I'm just curious.
Sorry for jumping in. I recalled Vladimir Karamurza here in Tbilisi always was complaining when someone was reflecting on the results of the polls. Forget the polls in Russia. You can imagine how is it done and how realistic. What do you think? How I really a very good question.
Yeah. I'm also not a sociologist, so I wouldn't have. I'm sort of agnostic on it. I mean, the Levada people say that they have methods to solve it.
Yes,
so they can frame the questions in a way that they can sort of neutralize this sort of. And then there has been an argument about that many people simply don't answer the polls, you know. And then what is with all these people who never actually? And then the suspicion is, of course, that they don't take part in the polls because they would then perhaps say something that would be anti-Putin and that could then put them into trouble. And here again, the Nevada people say they can take care, they have methods to take care of it. And they are very much aware of it. But you know, I've grown up in East Germany, and I still remember these last years of East Germany. You would be careful what you would say to somebody. It's just, you know, because I mean, I don't know how it's. I haven't been in Russia for 10 years, but in East Germany there was this sort of gray zone. You know, and you never knew what if you say something in public to somebody you don't know. Maybe nothing will happen, or maybe something horrible will happen, or something in between, or you may not get a study place, or you may get problems at workplace, or maybe somebody will knock at your door. You never know. And it was kept on purpose like that. And in the aftermath, I thought, you know, it was actually much less repressive than we all suspected it was. You could have said actually much more. And you know, because eventually, let's say in East Germany, the people who were really killed by the regime was not very high. And then they may put you in prison, but it wasn't actually that bad. So, but there was always you did not know in advance, you know, how bad it could become. So that's why I'm also skeptical about these results. And there's also there's an interesting book by Sam Green and the co-author Putin versus the People, and what they say, and that is also I think very valid here, that there is this sort of a bias in general of people, and especially of Russians, to be conformists. So you know, just to be like the mainstream is, yeah. So, and not to be something a dissident, you know, because a dissident is sort of, it's both psychologically and even it may be discomfort, certain discomfort, and then people, if you would have a different mainstream, then people may actually shift. You know, and there's no stable actually opinion. It's just shifting, so that people don't look into themselves what they think, but they look at others. What do they, or what they assume are the others thinking. So that is also. So it's difficult to interpret this data. I mean, if the data is, if the Levada Center can all take care of all of that, then we are in a very bad place. Because then it means that there's a huge support for the war, and it's not going to end. But yeah, so that would be a very grim picture. Indeed, what the polling data really is valid. If the polling really measures what it says it measures, then we are in a very bad place here.
Okay. So we learned a lot. We've heard a lot of positive signals still from Andreas, and I hope very much that his optimism will become the reality in the nearest future. I thank you very much, Andreas, for your very insightful thoughts shared with us, views and the information you shared today with us. And please, I ask you to join me in thanking Mr. Umland and Thank you for coming. I wish you all the best in the upcoming 2024. Peace, happiness, healthiness, wellness, and then victories.
Thank you. I'm happy to give my card if you want to look on it.